Let's move into lesson 2, having seen some biblical theological bases for small group life. Let me suggest to you now support that with some historical arguments and a couple practical ones as well, though I think the historical testimonies might be of great interest to us here. I'm relying somewhat upon a book from William Beckham for some historical help here. The fact that he includes large sections of writers is what I'm more interested in than his actual words, because I don't know him as well. But he's got some choice sections in Luther and others here. He would contend, by the way, as a sort of a point here, that small groups have often resulted from or led to revival. I don't want to overdo that point. What I do want to see is help you hear Luther on this. And so Beckham writes, what you have in your notes here is the larger boxes are Beckham, and then the smaller boxes are the actual words of Luther or whoever he's quoting there. So he writes, Beckham writes, that Luther envisioned 3 kinds of worship. The first, the Latin Mass. The second, the German liturgy, bringing the language into the people, right? Remember, he wasn't trying to start a new movement. He just was trying to reform an old movement. But then he talks about a third kind of worship. These 2 orders of service, Luther writes, must be used publicly in the churches. Now, down to the next paragraph. The third kind of service should be a truly evangelical order and should not be held in a public place for all sorts of people. In other words, this is not just for the citizenry. If you were born in a Lutheran-dominated land, you were a member, right? If you were born in whatever land you were, you're a member of that church. Should be a truly evangelical order, should not be held in a public place for all sorts of people. But those who want to be Christians in earnest and who profess the gospel with hand and mouth, probably meaning both word and deed, profession and lived out Christianity, should sign their names and meet alone in a house somewhere to pray, to read, to baptize. This would be more of a cell church idea where you actually have literal house churches that are doing baptism, receive the sacraments. It's not something that we in our Southern Baptist world would argue for. I would not argue for. And to do other Christian works. Here one could set up a brief and neat order for baptism and the sacrament and center everything on the word, prayer, and love. That sounds exactly what we mean by a small group life, gathering for that purpose. Now, Beckham then talks about how Luther was frustrated. This never happened. And then he cites David Martin Lloyd-Jones, who commented on Luther, and says that Luther became depressed as the Reformation continued. He felt that the churches had responded to teaching were lacking true spiritual life and vigor. So here is what Lloyd-Jones diagnosed as why Luther was depressed, despairing. Another thing that greatly aggravated his feeling of depression was the phenomenon of Anabaptist life. I don't remember what the rest of that says there. He had to admit that there was a quality of life in their churches which was absent in the churches to which he belonged. Well, yeah, right? It's called regeneration. It's called born-again believers who make up your church, as opposed to citizens of any German or Germanic land. So he reacts in 2 ways to them. He has got to discipline his people against them, those Anabaptists who are going to baptize again, and yet he wishes to have in his church the kind of thing that was working so well in their churches. The result of all this was that he felt that the only thing to do was to gather together people who were truly Christian into a kind of inner church, So a church within a church. The true believers within the church. And now you see the beauty of our view of church as Southern Baptists. Well, what happened after that? Between Luther and Wesley, Philip Jacob Spener, father of Pietism. I'll just bring the quote there directly. It is certain in any case that we preachers cannot instruct the people from our pulpit as much as is needful, unless other persons in the congregation who by God's grace have a superior knowledge of Christianity take pains by virtue of their universal Christian priesthood to work with and under us to correct and reform as much in their neighbors as they're able according to the measure of their gifts and their simplicity. The pulpit is not enough. The worship services are not enough, says Spener. I've cited a work that I've not read, so I'm not going to unpack it. Under number 2, the English, the Puritans there, the Joanne Jung, or Young, I don't know, Godly Conversation, Rediscovering the Puritan Practice of Conference. But let me jump down to John Wesley, or Whitefield and Wesley, but starting with Wesley. So Beckham writes about Wesley. Wesley gave shape and force to the movement. And now he's going to quote from Howard Snyder, who is a Wesleyan expert. The Methodist societies were divided into classes and bands. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say the societies were the sum total of class and band members, since the primary point of belonging was that this more intimate level of community and membership in a class was required before one could join the society. So it's almost as if we're talking about a small group you are a part of in order to be part of the bigger whole. The class meeting was the cornerstone of the whole edifice. The classes, and here class, I'm telling you, think small group life. The classes were in effect house churches, not classes like we mean for instruction, as the term class might suggest. Meeting in the various neighborhoods where people lived, so they had a geographical plan. Of course, they don't have cars and drive all over Louisville or whatever city you might be living in. The classes normally met one evening each week for an hour or so. Each person reported on his or her spiritual progress or on particular needs or problems and received the support and prayers of the others. Advice or reproof was given as need required. Quarrels were made up, misunderstandings removed, and after an hour or two, originally it was an hour or so, now it's an hour or two, spent in this labor of love, they concluded with prayer and thanksgiving. That's the description of what a Wesleyan meeting would look like. Whitefield, contemporary of Wesley, one who brought forth the movement in different directions or expanded the movement there. He has a very similar vision here. And here he's exhorting the people of God. You see the quote? Wesley summed up his attitude underneath that. My brethren, find the place that begins there. My brethren, let us plainly and freely tell one another what God has done for our souls. To this end, you would do well, as others have done, so in Whitefield's mind, there's historical precedent for this, to form yourselves into little companies of 4 or 5 each. I've said an ideal group would be 9 to 12, allowing for sicknesses and absences, but if you want the kind of intimacy we're talking about, something even smaller. And do what? Meet once a week to tell each other what is in your hearts, that you may then also pray for and comfort each other as need shall require. None but those who have experienced it can tell the unspeakable advantages of such a union and communion of souls. I can remember coming to my church in West Virginia that was a traditional church. Having come out of the experiences I mentioned already, both in my dormitory life and then in my seminary college days there, feeling this dryness of not having this opportunity to get together with other believers. I can feel a little bit. Having experienced that, I felt the dryness. And the problem is there are people in the church who've never experienced it, and I talk about small group life. They've not experienced it, so they're not getting excited about it. None, I think, that truly loves his own soul and his brethren as himself will be shy of opening his heart in order to have their advice, reproof, admonition, and prayers as occasions require. A sincere person will esteem it one of the greatest blessings. To which I'd say, amen. Another historical example. One more. One that many of you would not know about because I've told you I was ordained in the Evangelical Free Church. In the 18th century, in the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, you would have state churches that were Lutheran churches. And if you were born in that country, you're a member of the church, your state church. The word free in churches like Evangelical Free historically doesn't mean anything in the United States because no churches are under state control. But they were called free churches that then migrated to the United States. What began there is what's called, it's a Swedish word for readers, the Lassare movement. Lassare, Swedish word for readers. This movement, what it was is that people would go to the state church during the day, in the mornings, and hear the Lutheran priest do his thing in Mass, corrupt speech, corrupt lifestyles, and would come home and get together with each other in their homes who really loved God and His Word and would read the Bible. And that's where you began to form actual churches formed out of that, free from state control. Well, I hope that kind of gets you excited, maybe at least to tell you that there are no, we're not talking about a new thing. This isn't 20th century stuff or 21st century, this idea of small group life. It's always been around among the people of God.